The dead man's name was Glindra Michael. He died alone on the cold floor of an abandoned warehouse in London in January 1943. He was homeless, a vagrant, a man unwanted by anyone, without family, work, or an address. No one looked for his body. No one reported him missing. The coroner recorded his death as poisoning. Apparently, rat poison in bread he had picked up from the ground. It was an accidental, meaningless, nameless death, one of dozens that occurred every week in wartime London. A few months later, this man would change the course of World War II and the world as a whole. If you think that's an exaggeration, then settle in, and you'll hear the story of one of the most audacious, risky, and successful intelligence operations ever conceived. But first, let's look at the numbers, because without them, it's impossible to grasp the full scale of what was at stake. It was the summer of 1943. The Allies were preparing to invade Europe via the Mediterranean. The only logical staging ground was Sicily. The island jutted out of the sea, an obvious stepping stone from North Africa to the Italian mainland. Everyone knew this. The Germans knew it. Hitler himself knew it, personally telling his generals that the next strike would come through Sicily and that troops needed to be stationed there. 160,000 German and Italian soldiers, coastal fortifications, air support, and tanks awaited them. If the Allies landed where they were expected, it would be a slaughter. Casualties were estimated in the tens of thousands in the first few days alone. The operation could fail, drag on for years, or even turn the tide of the entire war in the enemy's favor. Only one thing needed to be done: convince the Germans that the invasion would not come through Sicily. This is where a man walked into a British military intelligence office with an idea so outlandish that initially, no one took it seriously. His name was Ewan Montague, a naval intelligence officer and a lawyer by training. He possessed that particular breed of English mind that could push logic to its absolute limits, places where an ordinary person wouldn't go because it was improper, impossible, or simply too strange. Montague sat across from his colleague, Charles Cholmondeley. A sheet of paper lay between them. "We need a dead body," Montague said. Cholmondeley wasn't surprised. They had both read the same document, a 1939 memo by an intelligence officer that casually mentioned the idea. If an enemy were to find a body carrying fake secret documents, they might fall for it. The memo had been written by a then-young officer named Ian Fleming. Yes, that Ian Fleming, who would later create James Bond. But that, while not entirely unrelated, is a story for another time. The idea itself was simple. As always, the devil was in the details. To feed disinformation to the Germans via a body, they needed a body. A real, human body. A dead man with documents. The documents had to be secret enough for the Germans to believe they had struck gold, convincing enough to be passed up the chain of command, and specific enough to alter troop deployments. Crucially, the body itself had to be real. Germany's military intelligence, the Abwehr, was adept at distinguishing genuine from fake, especially when it came to human remains. Wartime forensics were skilled at asking inconvenient questions. How long had the person been dead? What was the cause of death? Did the body's condition match what was stated in the documents? Was he alive when he entered the water? This last question was crucial. Because the plan called for this: the body of a British Royal Marines officer with a briefcase of secret documents chained to his wrist was to be found off the coast of Spain. The scenario would suggest he had fallen from a plane that crashed at sea. Spain was officially neutral, but its military intelligence actively cooperated with the Germans. The Germans would learn of the body, gain access to the documents, read them, and believe them. That was the plan in broad strokes. Now, the problems. Problem 1, where to get a body. Not a mannequin, not a dummy, a real human body. And the person needed to have died from a cause compatible with the legend. Because if a German pathologist examined the body and found signs of death inconsistent with drowning or a plane crash, the entire operation would become a trap. The Germans would realize they were being deceived, and not only would they ignore the documents, but they would use the disinformation to deduce the real plan. Montague turned to pathologist Sir Bernard Spilsbury, a legendary figure in British forensic medicine, a man who had solved hundreds of cases, a man to whom one could ask the question, how must a person die for their body after several days at sea to resemble that of an air crash victim? Spilsbury didn't answer immediately. He pondered. Then he said the person must have died from something related to the lungs, pneumonia, drowning, or certain types of poisoning. Only then would there be fluid in the lungs. Only then would a pathologist conducting a superficial examination, and the Spanish were unlikely to perform a full autopsy on a foreign officer, find nothing to contradict the theory of death by drowning. Rat poison. Glyndwr Michael had died from rat poison in bread. The poison had caused liver and lung damage. Not ideal, but close enough. With a superficial examination, after several days in the cold Atlantic waters, the Spanish pathologist shouldn't find anything critical. Montague had his body. Now problem 2. Far more complex than the first. The dead man needed an identity. Not just a name and rank, but a real, living, breathing persona, with a history, habits, love letters in his pocket, a photo of a girlfriend in his wallet, a receipt from an expensive London club, a letter from his father, with minor debts, with a medical certificate for flat feet, with a theater ticket, with a grumpy note from the bank. Because German intelligence wasn't naive, they were professionals who, upon seeing the body of a foreign officer with secret documents, would immediately begin verifying every single detail, every name in the letters, every place mentioned, every position, every organization. If even one detail didn't align, they would know. Glyndwr Michael became Major William Martin, Royal Marines. His service number was checked against real personnel lists. His birth date was 1907. Birthplace, Cardiff, Wales. Religion, Protestant. Blood type, O. These details weren't pulled out of thin air. They were carefully selected and verified. Montague personally traveled to Wales, studying civil records. He pieced together details from real people to construct one convincing, non-existent individual. It was the painstaking work not of a spy, but rather of a skilled novelist, with the crucial difference that a novelist's error might cost a bad review, while Montague's error would cost thousands of lives. Now, a story was needed. Major Martin would be flying from London to North Africa, carrying secret letters from high command, from General Archibald Auchinleck himself, and from Sir Archibald Nye, Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff. The letters contained unmistakable hints that the main attack was not being prepared against Sicily at all, but rather against Sardinia and Greece. Sicily was mentioned as a diversion, a feint. To enhance credibility, the documents were written casually, like genuine official correspondence between people who knew each other well. They included professional jargon, personal remarks, and even a joke about the weather. The letters took several days to write. They were rewritten, phrases were refined, and people familiar with the specific general's writing styles were consulted. This was essential because the German intelligence officer who would read these letters was himself an educated and experienced man. He could sense a fake. He had read thousands of captured documents. He knew how real British military officers wrote and how people trying to sound like British military officers wrote. It had to be authentic. But the documents were only half the persona. William Martin had to be a living person with a living life. And this is where the operation took on a unique, almost theatrical flavor that made it more than just a military story. Montague found a young woman named Jeanne Leslie, an attractive employee of the intelligence department. Montague asked her for a favor, a strange, incredible, but vitally important one. He asked her to become the dead man's fiancée. Jeanne Leslie wrote 2 letters, not official, not businesslike, genuine love letters, with an intonation that couldn't be faked if not truly felt. They expressed anxiety for a man going on assignment, subtle hints of jealousy, tenderness, and plans for a future that would never be. They were the letters of a woman who loved and feared loss. Her name in the letters was Pam, the name Jeanne Leslie's loved ones used for her. A photograph accompanied the letters. Jeanne Leslie had posed for it specifically. A portrait of a young woman smiling with a natural gaze. Nothing extraordinary, and that's precisely what made the photograph so convincing. Real lovers keep ordinary snapshots. They don't carry posed portraits in their wallets. Then, a receipt was added. From Samuel Brothers and Sons Jewelers on Bond Street for an engagement ring. £26, 10 shillings. The receipt was dated a few weeks before Martin's supposed death. A groom buying a ring. A man in love on the eve of a dangerous assignment. This small scrap of paper was, perhaps, the most important detail of all, because it transformed a nameless officer into a man with a future, with plans, with commitments to a living woman. Dead men with fiancées aren't invented for disinformation. Next, a letter from his father. It was written by a real person, the father of one of the intelligence officers, an elderly, reserved Welshman. The letter had that particular paternal tone where words and feelings don't quite align for obvious reasons. It expressed disapproval of his son's frivolous behavior, a reminder of family values, and a sternness that, upon careful reading, revealed itself as anxiety. A real man wrote a real letter, just not to his own son. A medical certificate was added. Major Martin had flat feet. This was important for two reasons. First, medically. Flat feet for a Royal Marine officer explained why he was flying rather than sailing. Second, psychologically. No one invents flat feet for a mythical person. Such details only belong to real people. A bus ticket was added, from London, dated a few days before his supposed flight. Crinkled, used. This small piece of cardboard told the German analyst, "This person rode a bus a few days ago. An ordinary person, living an ordinary life." A bill from the Naval and Military Club on Piccadilly was included, for 2 lunches. A small sum, an insignificant detail. But these are precisely the kinds of details that aren't invented. They are simply accumulated through living. A letter from the bank was added, standard, slightly annoyed. The bank reminded Major Martin that his account was slightly over its permitted limit and requested that he rectify the situation. £20 over the limit. A small debt belonging to a real person who lives and spends money and sometimes forgets to keep track of his balance. Major William Martin now had a life. All that remained was to send him to his death. The body was stored in a special dry ice container. This presented a separate logistical challenge, to deliver the body to the Spanish coast in proper condition so that the time of death, when examined, would align with the presumed date of the plane crash. If decomposition set in too early, the Spanish pathologist would ask awkward questions. Too late, and the story of a plane crash would fall apart. The submarine HMS Seraph. Its commander was Lieutenant Commander Norman Jewell. He was one of the few men in the entire British fleet who could be entrusted with such a mission and be told precisely what he was carrying. On April 30th, 1943, at 4:30 a.m., a few kilometers off the mouth of the Guadalquivir River near the Spanish coast city of Huelva, the Seraph surfaced. The water was cold, the darkness profound. Jewell ordered the crew below. Only he and 2 other officers remained on deck. The container was opened. Major Martin's body, dressed in a Royal Marine Major's uniform, with insignia and a life vest, was placed in the water. The briefcase with documents was chained to his wrist, the way top-secret materials were transported, the way real couriers secured them. Jewell read a prayer, not for protocol, but because before him lay a real dead man, though homeless, though unwanted in life, still a human being, and it felt like the right thing to do. The current did the rest. On the morning of May 1st, a fisherman named José Antonio Rey Maria set out in his boat from Huelva. He spotted the body in a life vest, recovered it, and delivered it to the authorities. From there, everything unfolded exactly as Montague had planned. Spanish military authorities notified the German agent, Karl Erich Kuhlenthal, an Abwehr officer working in Spain. He was a professional and cautious man. Kuhlenthal gained access to the documents, not directly, but through Spanish intermediaries. The documents were carefully opened, photographed, resealed, and returned. Kuhlenthal was astonished. The letters appeared absolutely authentic. The style was correct. The names were verifiable, the jargon was genuine, and the content was a bombshell. If these letters were to be believed, British command was planning a diversionary maneuver in Sicily, while the main attacks would come against Sardinia and through Greece to the Balkans. Kuhlenthal sent a report to Berlin. In Berlin, they deliberated for several days. They cross-referenced, they analyzed, and they believed. Hitler personally issued orders. 2 panzer divisions were sent to Greece. Sardinia's defenses were reinforced. Minefields were laid off the coast of the Peloponnese. Submarines were redeployed. This regrouping of forces took weeks and demanded colossal resources. Sicily remained relatively undefended. Here, we need to pause and consider a detail easily missed in the flow of events. German intelligence was not naive. The Abwehr operated professionally. Kuhlenthal was an experienced officer, and yet they believed. Why? Because of the jewelry store receipt? Because of the crumpled bus ticket? Because of the bank letter about 20 pounds over the limit? Because of the photograph of a smiling woman named Pam? Big lies are sold by small truths. The German analyst reviewing Major Martin's documents might have questioned the strategic content of the letters, but he couldn't question a worn-out bus ticket and a 20-pound bank overdraft. Such details aren't invented. Such details simply happen. This is where Montague understood human nature better than most psychologists. People don't believe in the grand and important. They believe in the small and insignificant. Show me a state secret, and I'll look for a trick. Show me a jewelry receipt, and I'll believe you're in love. On July 10th, 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily. Operation Husky, the largest amphibious invasion in the history of warfare up to that point, involved 160,000 soldiers, 1,400 vessels, and 4,000 aircraft. Sicily's German garrison had been weakened. The redeployment of troops to Greece and Sardinia left the island vulnerable. Battles were fought. People died, on both sides. War is war. But the losses were incomparably less than what had been projected against a full German defense. The island was taken in 38 days. Churchill was brief. The operation proceeded according to plan. He did not elaborate on which plan. Now, about Montague, because his story didn't end with victory. After the war, he wrote a book, The Man Who Never Was, published in 1953. It became a bestseller, saw multiple editions, and was later made into a film. Montague became a celebrity as much as an intelligence officer can become one by recounting his own operation. He described the details. He was proud of the details. He had every right to be. But there was one detail he rarely spoke about: Glyndwr Michael. In his book, Montague dedicated only a few lines to him, referring to him as a Welsh vagrant. He noted that the use of the body was arranged with the coroner, that there were no relatives, and that no one objected. It sounded clean. From a legal standpoint, it was. But try to imagine it differently. A man dies alone on the floor of an abandoned warehouse, an accidental, nameless death. His body is taken by the military. For several months it lies in a dry ice container while clever people in London invent a life for him that he never had. A fabricated fiancé, a fabricated father, a fictitious 20-pound debt, an engagement ring he never held in his hands. Then, he is lowered into the cold sea off a foreign shore, with a stranger's name, in a stranger's uniform, and he changes the course of the war. Glyndwr Michael is buried in a British military cemetery in Huelva, Spain. For many years, his grave bore a plaque with the name Major William Martin. His real name remained classified, as the operation itself remained secret for many years after the war. It wasn't until 1998 that the British government declassified the documents. Only then were historians able to establish his true identity. Only then did the plaque change, adding the line, Glyndwr Michael, serving as Major William Martin. 55 years later, a man who died in obscurity finally received his name, half a century after changing history. But here's something that was never classified, and which most historians mention only in passing: the Spanish side. Huelva, a small port city, the local military commandant, the naval commander of the district. the people who first received the body and who transmitted the information to the Germans. Or might not have. Because there was another fork in the road that Montague barely wrote about. Not all Spanish officers collaborated with the Germans with equal enthusiasm. There were those who could have officially buried the body without making a fuss. There were those who could have opened the briefcase and destroyed its contents out of a principle of neutrality. There were those who simply had no contact with German intelligence. Montague chose Huelva for a reason. Kuhlenthal worked there. There was a reliable channel to the Germans. There was a guarantee that the documents would reach their intended recipient. Think about that. For the disinformation to work, it had to be guaranteed that the enemy would receive it. The operation was built on the assumption that a German intelligence officer in a Spanish city would do precisely what a British officer in a London office expected him to do. Two men who never met. Different armies. Different languages. One invents a trap. The other falls into it. And between them, a dead man with a crumpled bus ticket in his pocket. After the war, Kuhlenthal continued his career, working in intelligence and writing memoirs. There is not a single word about Major Martin in his memoirs. Either he didn't know he had been deceived, or he knew and chose to remain silent. Both possibilities are, in their own way, eloquent. John Leslie, the young woman who wrote the love letters in the name of the non-existent Pam, lived a long life. She married, had children, and occasionally gave interviews in her old age. She said she wrote the letters sincerely, trying to think like a woman who loved and feared. She said it was strange to write love letters to a dead man, knowing he was dead, knowing the enemy would read the letters, knowing that thousands of lives depended on the quality of those letters. "I just tried to write honestly," she said in one interview. "Honest words convinced them more than any military plan." Honest words convinced them more than any military plan. This is perhaps the best description of Operation Mincemeat that exists. Better than academic monographs. Better than military analytical reviews. Better than Montague's own book. War, ultimately, is about what people believe. The Germans believed in the crumpled bus ticket. They believed in the bank overdraft. They believed in the receipt for an engagement ring. They were undone by the very thing that makes people human, the tendency to trust small, concrete details more than grand, abstract concepts. Glyndwr Michael knew none of this. He died alone on a cold floor and never knew his death would mean anything. He didn't know his body would cross the sea. He didn't know his pockets would be filled with a fabricated life. He didn't know a fisherman would find him at dawn. He didn't know a German officer would read letters addressed to him. He didn't know Hitler would move divisions. He didn't know that tens of thousands of Allied soldiers would remain alive because they weren't expected where they landed. He didn't know a stranger's name would be written on his grave, that his own name would be restored 55 years later, that one day books would be written about him, films would be made, articles published, that a homeless man who died from rat poison in a London warehouse would become one of the most important people of World War II. The most incredible thing about Operation Mincemeat was not its technical sophistication, not the boldness of its conception, not the professionalism of its execution. The most incredible thing was that the entire construct rested on an assumption about human nature, on the belief that an Abwehr intelligence officer in a Spanish city would read a love letter from a woman and feel the same thing anyone would feel, that it was real, that a living person was behind it. Montague was right. The dead man turned out to be more alive than the living.